Hello, this is assignment number 1 for BFIN 317 Financial Modeling, and today I will be forecasting the sales revenue and income statement for Ford Motor Company. Ford is an iconic American automotive manufacturer that has been in operation for over a century. The company was officially established in June of 1903, and 1 month later, Ford sold its first vehicle. In 1956, Ford announced its first initial public offering, which for the time was the largest IPO in history. Several decades later, it released its first fully electric vehicle, the Ford Ranger EV. Moving forward to the present, Ford currently has a 13.9% domestic market share, making it the third largest automotive manufacturer in the United States. Now, before getting into the forecast, we need to talk about some assumptions that are going to be made. So, the first assumption is that Ford's sales revenue and income is going to be influenced by the cyclical nature of the economy. Now, what this means is that when the economy is doing good, we'll expect to see higher sales, and when the economy is doing poor, we are expecting to see lower sales. This has a lot to do with households and excess cash. When the economy is doing well, they're more likely to spend money on more expensive items like vehicles, and when the economy is doing poor, we are likely to see less excess cash in households, and they are probably going to be less likely to purchase expensive items like vehicles. Now, I also want us to keep in mind that going into the near future, we're likely to see tighter government regulations on emissions. In addition to the competition from already established EV manufacturers like Tesla, we're going to see pressure coming from multiple angles on Ford, which will likely affect sales. For this reason, I'm going to be taking a more conservative approach when forecasting out sales and income. Moving on to the sales forecast, the first thing that is noticed here is that the sales over the previous 11 years are moving in a steady upward trend, with the exception of several years. Here we can see where the first assumption comes into play in years 2012 and 2019 to 2021. In the years leading up to 2012, the economy was experiencing the effects of the housing crisis, and in 2008, the major automotive companies received government bailouts. In 2012, sales seemed to start rebounding out of that downturn. In addition, the economy was uncertain and unstable in 2019 to 2021, and this is also reflected here in the sales. For the sales forecast, I would expect to see the continuation of an upward trend into the near future, with the optimism that the worst economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are behind us. With that being said, I would expect to start seeing less dramatic changes in sales revenue and a return to a steady increase in revenue. Going into 2023, sales should drop off of that high 15.9% change seen in the previous year, and then getting around that 1.5% in years 2024 and 2025. So here's the graphical representation of the sales revenue that I just spoke about. Here it's easier to see the steady upward trend that Ford saw in the years leading up to the pandemic. And for this projection, I went with a simple linear regression and with an R-squared value of 0.78. Now moving over to this graph, it's just the same graph as the historical sales with the additional projections for the next 3 years. And with this sales graph, the predicted sales, they look like they just picked up where Ford left off in 2018, with that steady upward trend continuing. Now onto the historical income statement. The total revenues was already discussed in the sales forecast, so these numbers will remain the same. Moving down the sheet, Ford saw a low gross profit in 2020, likely because of the pandemic and its impact on the economy, but Ford was able to bring it back up in the following years. There's also quite a high increase in the operating expense in 2021, but this is likely to be another outlier due to the fact that it settled down in the following year, closer to the numbers seen in 2020. Given the information seen above, the operating income follows the same trend, with low results in 2020 and a rebound following in the next 2 years. Following operating income, we're going to be looking at additional income in expense items, and this is going to be the most important when looking at the historical income statement, as Ford experienced some major swings from a single investment during these years. Ford was holding a large investment in a company called Rivian, and this company is an automotive manufacturer in the EV industry. In 2021, Ford saw an abnormal gain from this investment of $9.1 billion, and in the following year, Ford saw a $7.4 billion loss. Because of this, the income statement shows a large difference between the years of 2021 and 2022. This swing between Ford's capital gains and losses have an effect on every item below it on the income statement. Moving down the income statement to the final net incomes, there's a large spread seen between 2021 and 2022, and there are going to be some alterations to the forecast because of these abnormal years. Now on the common side, it's easy to see that Ford has high costs of revenue, which decreases the gross profit margin. Because the year 2020 saw low sales, likely due to the pandemic, I decided to exclude it from my average used in the forecast. I don't find it likely that the cost of revenue will go back to being around 95%, and because of this decision, this leaves Ford's gross profit revenue to be around 11% in the forecast. There isn't much to mention about the other items down the sheet until getting to the additional income and expense items again. The large swings that were seen in the previous section are seen here again in the varying percentages, and this translates down into the final net income at the bottom of the common sized. Finally, we are moving on to the projections for the next 3 years. The projections here are the same as seen in the graphical representation. Looking at the percentage changes, there's a high change from 2021 to 2022, and this is likely due to the recovery of the supply chain and an increased confidence from consumers in the economy. I expect to see this number settle down and be around 1.6% for year 2024. Looking at the cost of revenues again, there was a large increase from 2021 to 2022. I believe this to be abnormal as there were many supply chain issues and the price of many items increased during this time. For that reason, I expect this number to settle down into the short term. To figure out the projections for the cost of revenue, I decided to exclude the year 2020. This is because the cost of revenue was very high at 95%, as seen in the common sized. The following years were both closer to 88%, and I figured this to be much more likely into the short term. It's not very likely that Ford would be able to maintain such high costs into the future, as it's not very sustainable for a company. These choices suggest that Ford will start seeing consistent gross profits into the future. For operating expense, I simply took the average of the most recent 3 years, as they were all around 7 and 8%. Operating income is the difference of gross profit and operating expense, and this brings Ford just under $7 billion. Additional income expense items was a little tricky given the large changes between the 3 years. For this reason, I decided to exclude years 2021 and 2022, as these are not normal returns. I then went back 3 more years to see what Ford typically sees on its investments. This section of the income statement has gradually been increasing in the years leading up to the pandemic. Because of this, I took the percent on the common sized only from year 2020, which was 3.8%. I believe this to be a fair assessment, as Ford did get rid of its investment in Rivian due to its volatility. With this change, the following items on the income statement become much more stable and consistent into the future. Everything else is quite standard until reaching the income tax. Because of the decision to use the 2020 percentage from capital gains, I also decided to use the same tax percentage from 2020 for some consistency rather than using the average from all 3 years. This brings Ford's income tax for each of the next 3 years around $215 million. Before getting to the final projected net income, I'd like to draw attention to the R&D expenses at the bottom of the sheet. Ford lists R&D in its cost of revenue section. It has steadily been increasing over the last several years, and I think that this trend will continue into the future at a more accelerated rate. As mentioned on the assumptions slide, government restrictions and regulations are being pushed on the automotive industry to move towards EVs. This is going to require a considerable investment in the coming years, and this will be reflected in the net income. This is part why I decided to take a conservative approach in my projection. Putting everything together, this finally brings us to the forecasted net incomes. After everything is accounted for, I would expect to see net income for Ford to be 11 billion, 11.2 billion, and 11.4 billion for years 2023, 2024, and 2025 respectively. And here are the references from some sites that I use to get a lot of this information from.